The U.S. is shifting its military focus to countering China and Russia, but it's still stuck in the Middle East. Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Over the past 2 decades, the U.S. has generally focused its military might on counterinsurgency in the Middle East. Now the U.S. is switching its focus as Russia and China become an ever-increasing threat. The U.S. is building up firepower and military infrastructure to counter both countries, while also relearning how to wage conventional warfare. That's a big shift, one that will require a lot of resources and attention. And yet, the U.S. is still militarily engaged in the Middle East. There are U.S. soldiers stationed throughout the Middle East in various numbers, from roughly 900 posted in Syria to 13,500 in Kuwait. These numbers are much smaller than in the past. At its peak in 2007, the U.S. deployed 170,000 troops in Iraq alone. But this still raises questions about the U.S.'s role in the Middle East, and whether it's the right call to continue conducting military operations there. President Biden continues to insist that the U.S. will not walk away from the Middle East, despite his promises to end the forever wars in the Middle East. So why is it that the U.S. is still conducting military operations in the Middle East? The simple and obvious answer is oil, which is true, but there are other reasons. One reason that U.S. officials point to is countering ISIS. In 2011, the last U.S. troops left Iraq. But then, ISIS surprised the world by quickly expanding in Iraq and Syria. Its territory gains peaked in 2014, and the U.S. went right back in. Thanks to a U.S.-led alliance counteroffensive, ISIS is a lot less influential than it once was. However, it still persists as a problem of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. ISIS continues to conduct attacks, especially on prisons to free ISIS detainees. The attacks aren't stopping anytime soon. Dozens of attacks have also been launched at or near bases in Syria, and that's just in the past year. The U.S. is afraid that if it withdraws its military presence in Syria and other nearby regions, ISIS and other violent Islamist organizations will rise up again, similar to how the Taliban reconquered Afghanistan after Biden's botched withdrawal. So the U.S. continues to strike back, particularly by targeting ISIS leaders. The U.S. is also working with regional partners like the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, although that's now being complicated by Turkish raids. Some also see it as the U.S.'s duty to prevent Turkey from conducting attacks against the Kurds in northern Syria. But ISIS aside, there's another reason why the U.S. is still conducting operations in the Middle East, and that reason is Iran. I'll explain after the break. Welcome back. The U.S. believes that if it withdraws from the Middle East, it will leave a power vacuum. Arguably, that did happen in the past with ISIS, but ISIS isn't the only threat in the Middle East. One major player that the U.S. doesn't want filling a power vacuum is Iran, especially since it frequently threatens the U.S. and its allies, particularly Israel and Saudi Arabia. Even worse, Iran aims to obtain its own nuclear weapons. The U.S. doesn't want Iran threatening the world's access to oil fields. Iran, meanwhile, wants to undermine the U.S. to serve its own interests, which is why it targets the U.S. and its allies through proxies, such as the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and Hezbollah. To bolster its allies, Iran also sends weapons to places like Syria and Lebanon, including missiles and drones. So there's all that, plus the ongoing attacks conducted by Iran. That's how some justify the current U.S. presence in Iraq. They say that U.S. troop presence helps counter Iranian influence and also reduce Iranian weapon transfers by land. That's also why some still advocate for the U.S. to stay in Syria. Syria plays an integral role in Iran's strategy to become the biggest power in the Middle East, expel all U.S. forces from the region, and destroy Israel. This has led to a lot of back-and-forth attacks in Syria between Iran and the U.S. Altogether at this point, the U.S. is basically in a proxy war with Iran in Syria. But it's not just Syria. America's rivalry with Iran also extends to Yemen. Saudi Arabia and Iran have been competing for influence over Yemen for years. ever since the Iran-backed Houthi rebels threatened to overthrow Yemen's Saudi-backed government in 2014. Since then, the U.S., from the Obama administration onwards, has provided logistical and intelligence support to Yemen, along with jet refueling and airstrikes to help a Saudi Arabia-led campaign against the Houthis. It worked out well for the U.S. since the U.S. was already fighting al-Qaeda in Yemen. It also served U.S. national interests by preventing Iranian arms sales. As a bonus, U.S. support to Yemen prevented Iran-backed forces from impacting free passage in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the choke point between the Arabian and Red Seas, which is vital for the global transport of oil. That's how some justify the U.S. presence in Yemen. Even though Biden promised to end support for offensive military operations in Yemen in 2021, the Biden administration continues to do counterterrorism in Yemen, with an undisclosed number of military personnel in the country. The U.S. also continues to provide aid to Saudi Arabia and its allies, aid that some would argue isn't just defensive in nature. The U.S. tries to stay on Saudi Arabia's good side. That's why the U.S. was willing to defend Saudi Arabia against critics who accused it of causing mass starvation and a fuel shortage with the blockade in Yemen. The U.S. also still supports Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, even though the Yemen government and Houthi rebels signed a UN-led ceasefire that continues to this day, even though it expired. The fear is that ending support for the war would complicate ongoing negotiations. And many people don't like how the U.S. is getting entangled with Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries militarily. Critics argue that the U.S. should pull out of the Middle East because the U.S. has no clearly defined end goal other than to just stop terrorists. And continued U.S. involvement will only create more problems that need solving at the taxpayer's expense. Many people have no patience these days for the U.S. being dragged deeper into conflict that could needlessly risk lives, all while increasing resentment from locals. Some argue that conflicts should just be left to the regional powers to settle on their own. But despite what many people may argue, the U.S. will likely continue intervening in the Middle East and finding more reasons to do so, such as countering China and Russia there, especially given how both countries are trading weapons with the Middle East and working to gain political influence. So really, at this point, preparing to deal with China and Russia means staying involved in the Middle East. And we're right back where we started. So what do you think of the U.S.'s military involvement in the Middle East? Leave your comments below. If you like this show, remember that we rely mainly on direct support from viewers like you. All it takes is as little as $1 per episode over on our crowdfunding website, Patreon. It's patreon.com/America Uncovered for more. Click the link below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.